So who is our speaker? He is the managing director of the Blackstone Group, which was a group of New York investment bankers. And then I'm just going to run very quickly through a lot of things. He also is former managing director of Shearson Lehman Brothers in New York. He's worked in Peru, Costa Rica, Panama, directed the Panama-Japan office of Shearson Lehman. He's been in Hong Kong, worked at a huge reorganization there. He's worked in Germany, Japan, Mexico. He's on call for practically all presidents, Nixon, Ford, Carter. He's been on the White House Council on International Economic Policy, the State Department Policy Planning Staff. He's written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, our Foreign Affairs magazine. But he has a master's and a doctorate from Johns Hopkins University. Show you what a small world it is, in spite of his claim that it's a big world. Now, I'm going to do a very unkind thing to our speaker. I'm going to take the words right out of his mouth and tell you this. He's just got a new book out, 3 weeks out, 3 weeks off the press, and already loaded with excellent reviews. But let me tell you why they're excellent. This is the concluding paragraph. It was just about a century ago that America first saw the rise of Japan and Germany. There was concern then, not just about the ascendance of new military powers, but about the challenge to our way of life. Quote, "I preach to you," said Theodore Roosevelt in 1899, "that our country calls not for the life of ease, but for the life of strenuous endeavor. The 20th century looms before us big with the fate of many nations. If we stand idly by, if we shrink from the hard contest, then the bolder and stronger people will pass us by," unquote. Now what our speaker says is, this is his words, "Today the challenge is no less. At the turn of the last century, our forefathers rose to the occasion. Will we?" Jeffrey Garten.
Thank you very much. I'm touched by the introduction, and I'm also touched by the turnout here. I'm a little overwhelmed for a July evening. I never expected to have not only such a large audience, but such an energetic one. What I'd like to do is I'd like to just take a few minutes and kind of start with some of the thinking that I have had over the last couple of years as I have written this book, A Cold Peace. And I'd like to conclude with what's going on really this week in New York in the convention and try to bring all of the themes together. A Cold Peace, subject of my book, is about the United States, Japan, and Germany, and the relationships among the three countries. And I started out writing this about 2.5 years ago, before the Berlin Wall came down. And my reason for picking this subject was that I had lived in both Japan and Germany, had worked in both countries, and had actually quite a bit of experience in dealing with them, first as a government official and then as someone from the private sector in business. I thought these Japan and Germany were going to be important to the U.S. I thought they had some very interesting features in terms of comparing one with the other. But I never anticipated what writing about them would actually do. In the first instance, I started about 150 years ago, looking at the origins of modern United States, modern Japan, modern Germany. And what I found was that to a far greater extent than I had ever imagined, these were three countries with totally different ways of thinking, totally different cultures, totally different drives deriving from geopolitics, and deriving from really the way that the countries themselves were formed. I looked at the United States during the Revolutionary War. I looked at Japan when it opened to the world in the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s. And I looked at Germany as it was consolidated under Bismarck in the 1860s as well. And the more I looked at the three countries, the more I kept coming back to the United States and realizing that in some ways we were the unique country. We were the odd man out. And the more I became fascinated with our drives and how we got to where we are today. But the second thing that happened as I was writing is that the Berlin Wall did come down. And obviously the world changed very dramatically. Suddenly there was no superpower enemy. Suddenly communism was just an afterthought. The entire international ball game had changed. And it dawned on me that as the dust was clearing, I was looking at three countries now that were not only very, very different, but the three countries that were going to be responsible for most of what happens in the world now. For better or for worse, these were the three countries that had the most clout. These were the three countries that had the most power, measured in terms of what useful power meant now. But not only that, these three countries would be existing in an international setting that was radically different than anything we had known for quite a while. Because what had held them together was a kind of military glue, a glue that was born of American protection. Germany was close to the U.S., Japan was close to the U.S., we were united against a common enemy, but suddenly this glue was evaporating. And then the big question that I began to look at, and this was the focus of my book, or is the focus of my book, is in this radically new setting, knowing the deep-seated differences among the three countries, would they get together and focus their energies on the same problems in a coordinated way? Or would the old differences, the deep-seated differences, begin to reemerge? And I reluctantly came to the conclusion that the forces separating them, at least in the 1990s, which is really the focus of my analysis, that the forces separating them would get much stronger. That the assumption that a lot of people were making, that without a military threat and without military things to worry about, there would be plenty of time and plenty of energy to focus on building up a stronger and more prosperous world economy, that assumption was not the right one at all. And that's when I developed the title, A Cold Peace, by which I meant it's kind of a Cold War, only not military competition, but every other kind of competition, more than economic competition, also political. And instead of competing or with enemies, we were competing with friends, and this was going to be a much different experience than we had had certainly in our collective memories. And I became convinced as I wrote that the differences and the pressures separating the United States, Japan, and Germany would affect virtually every issue that was important to us. They would affect individual issues such as trade, obviously, such as the sharing of military burdens, such as how to cooperate on the environment, as we saw in the Rio summit, how to deal with the problems of world economic growth, as we've just seen in the failure of the Munich summit, how to deal with refugees. Virtually every major international issue would be affected by the diverging perspectives of America, Japan, and Germany. But beyond that, there were two areas which were even more significant, because individual issues may come or go, but there were two fundamental factors that were a real cause for concern. The first is that we had always made the assumption that the fault line of international conflict was between democracy and capitalism on one hand and communism on the other. Sometimes I call it, the competition between Adam Smith and Karl Marx. But what was happening now is that a new kind of competition was developing within the capitalist world. And we were seeing the emergence of three different kinds of capitalism. Americans' kind of Darwinian system, Japan's much tighter system between the government and business, Germany's social market economy, which has elements of organized markets and a very strong social safety net. And it's really the conflict of these systems, much more than the conflict or the competition among companies from these systems, which was going to characterize the next era of trade and investment and other kinds of economic conflict. And the second major problem which underlies everything, in my view, was that the world was not becoming such an integrated whole as we had thought, but in fact was breaking into trading blocks. And we see one of those blocks building in North America between the US, Canada, and Mexico. And we certainly see one building around Germany in Europe. And there's one now evolving in Asia, built around Japan. And so the very fundamental assumption that somehow the world was getting closer together, that it was converging on the American model, in my view, was simply not the right way to look ahead at the future. Now, I became convinced as I was thinking about these issues that one major implication for the United States was that we could not deal in this environment if we continued to separate our foreign and domestic policy. Because during the Cold War, we had a foreign policy based mostly on military stuff, and then we had the domestic economy, which for the good part of the time was in good shape. And our diplomacy had very little to do with our domestic economy and vice versa. But in the new era, with all this competition, with the different kinds of capitalism, with the trading blocks, my feeling was that we had to merge foreign and domestic policy as we never have had to do before, and that the economic dimension was becoming really paramount. And there were two reasons for this. One, that the elements of diplomacy and the elements of power in the New World were increasingly economic. And it meant that we had to have an economy that was vibrant, with competitive banks, with highly skilled labor force, with all the things we talk about that we really don't have. And secondly, it was increasingly important in this world that we were able to set an example by what our own society was. Because people listen to us, or America has some clout to the extent that we have a society that other people envy. And of course, for a long, long time, that was the case. But as the social fabric in this country began to unravel, it was increasingly less the case. Now, on both of these accounts, the economic vibrancy of the U.S. and our ability to set an example for other countries, I came to the conclusion that we were in terrible shape. It's not a big surprise that I come to this conclusion when you see some of the facts that I uncovered, and many of which have now become common wisdom, but I was doing this over the last couple of years. But in the U.S. right now, we have 10% of all the families subsisting on food stamps. We have 20% of all of our children living below the poverty line. We have a 100% increase in the number of families living below the poverty line in the 1980s. We have the highest murder rate in the industrialized world, with one person being killed every 25 minutes. Our budget for criminal justice is increasing 4 times faster than our budget for education. Compared to Japan and Germany, we've got the lowest rate of savings, We've got the lowest rate of investment. Their budgets for non-military research and development are increasing while ours are decreasing. Their budgets for infrastructure are increasing while ours are one-third of what they were in the 1960s. Compared to Japan and Germany, we've got the worst secondary school system, with a high school dropout rate now of 25%, and with 13% of our 17-year-olds unable to read, write, add, or subtract. We spend twice as much as a percentage of our GNP on health care as Japan and Germany. They live longer, and their infant mortality rate is much lower. But these numbers are less significant than the fact that every one of those problems that I talked about is getting worse and not better. We're adding to our national debt by $1 billion a day, which means that the resources that we need to address some of these problems are simply not going to exist, short of a revolution in the way we deal with our fiscal policy. We've got a real problem with the skills in our workforce. The National Association of Manufacturers estimates that there are 30 million people in the existing workforce that need extensive retraining. But that's not the beginning of the problem, because 60% of all new entrants into the workforce are from minorities whose starting point is even much lower when it comes to education. We spend $700 billion on entitlements. That's twice as much as it's more than twice as much as the defense budget. And on current policies, that number will reach $1 trillion by 1997. Let me give you an example from healthcare. In 1970, we spent 7% of the federal budget on healthcare. In 1990, 20 years later, it was 13%. In 1997, just 5 years from now, it's going to be 28%. The point is this, that our trajectory is in a very, very bad direction. Now, I don't think I have to belabor why these are important issues, and the point I want to make is that these issues that I'm talking about are integrally related to our foreign policy, and that's the connection that we have to make in the new world where we're competing with Japan and Germany, who make these kinds of connections all the time. It doesn't take a genius to see that unless we do something about our savings and investment, we continue to go into debt, and we continue to lose all independence or all flexibility with regard to what kind of country we are. It doesn't take a genius to see that if 20% of our kids live in poverty, the workforce of the future is going to be in terrible shape. If our economic and social trajectory continues, in my view, we face one of two scenarios. The first is that we will become a colony, dependent on foreign capital, dependent on foreign technology, and dependent on foreign manufacturers for most of our industry. The other possibility is that we simply don't care. We let things go, and then there's a violent reaction, and we will become highly protectionist with all of the damage that would do to us and the world economic system. Now, the question is there something that we can do about this? And my conclusion is most definitely we can. I say this partly out of conviction and partly out of optimism, because I think there's nothing about American society that would make one believe that we are destined to continue on a trajectory which virtually everyone realizes now is the wrong one. But I don't want to dwell on the specific policies, because there are lots of ideas in the air, what to do about health care, what to do about investment, what to do about savings, what to do about education. What's far more important is how these policies fit together. Because we're dealing here in a world where other countries have coherent systems which are different than ours. And my starting point is that we need a real revolution in the way we think about ourselves before we start talking about the details of individual policies. And I'd like to talk just about three things which I think are really crucial to our mindset. Three things that at least constitute the beginning of the revolution that I would like to see. The first is, a theme that I've already used, is that we have to integrate our national security thinking with our economy. The problems that we face, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's training, whether it's education, are now as high priority as were the military security problems that we faced over the last 50 years. And we've got to treat them that way with regard to where they are on the national agenda, how our public officials look at it, and how we ourselves look at these problems. The second revolutionary change in my mind is that we have got to look at the relationship between the public and the private sector in a much more balanced way than we have before. It's certainly not the fact that the government should do everything, but we go the other extreme and blame everything on the government, especially in this election year, saying that government is the problem. There's got to be a halfway mark, and there's got to be a model not unlike what most other countries have, in which there can be cooperation between the public and the private sector on a lot of problems that are really crucial, because neither has the resources nor the wherewithal to handle these major problems on their own. And third, we need a revolution in the very nature of our diplomacy. The essence of diplomacy in the future is not going to be arms control. It's going to be how to persuade Germany, just to take one example, to lower its interest rates. How to persuade Japan to open its market. How to negotiate arrangements which allow for much more cooperation among stock market authorities. This requires a much different kind of diplomacy than we have had. It requires different kinds of people. It requires, again, a revolution in the mindset. Now, I think that the biggest challenge that faces the next president under an optimistic scenario, and I say optimistic scenario because I'm assuming that the next president, whoever he is, will tackle the problems that I talked about. Maybe that's an over-optimistic assumption, but I'd just like to make it. I'd like to say that, look, I haven't said anything here. I haven't mentioned a problem that isn't on everybody's mind and virtually on everyone's lips. But the real challenge is going to be, how do you deal with these and not turn your back on the rest of the world? Because these problems are so overwhelming, and they require so many resources, not just financial, but the resources of our best people in the government and outside the government. And I worry about this a lot, because it looks to me like even if you take the convention now, take the Democratic platform, or take Governor Clinton's ideas about rejuvenating the economy. And I just take this because this is happening this week. If it was August, I would do it with President Bush. But Governor Clinton, as far as I can tell, is proposing to have a massive investment program in the country's infrastructure. He is looking for ways to get the American economy growing again, without which there's no hope for these problems. But he hasn't said anything about the foreign dimension of that challenge. And herein really lies the rub, because we can't, in this world, do these things on our own. Just to take an example, if the United States economy was suddenly to start growing faster, let's say as a result of a massive investment program, what would happen? Well, we would be sucking in imports from other countries at a much faster rate. They wouldn't be growing as fast, and therefore they would be exporting to us. We would again become sort of the dynamo of the world. A lot of the jobs that we had hoped to preserve, let's say in infrastructure rebuilding, would go to foreign contractors. A lot of the increased research and development projects would fall in the hands of foreign companies. And I'm not saying this is bad, but that would not be the purpose. That would not be the initial purpose of this kind of program, because this kind of program is designed to put Americans back to work. So there has to be a foreign dimension. There has to be a concomitant effort to get other countries to grow at the same time that we do. Or else there has to be some provisions in place to safeguard our own economy while we grow. There has to be some reciprocity on the part of other countries. Otherwise, we absorb all the burdens. This is a very tough act. But what it points to is this, that everything that goes on in this country now, every hope that we have, is tied primarily to our own efforts, of course, but also to the cooperation of other countries. And that cooperation, as we've seen in the last several weeks, is not coming automatically. It's not coming, in fact, it's not coming at all at this point. And that is a major challenge to the next president, to manage both this revolution at home and, I would say, a revolution abroad in terms of the way major countries have to cooperate. Now, I'm not so optimistic that we can pull this off. If we could just take care of ourselves, if we could just have a domestic renewal, that may in fact be the best that we can do. I've painted the ideal picture of a foreign and domestic policy that work together. But if we do that, the world is really going to be, the term a cold peace is going to be very applicable. Because without the U.S. in some kind of leadership position, and I don't mean a heavy-handed leadership, and I don't mean the kind of leadership we were able to exercise when we were clearly shoulders above everyone else. But without some kind of direction from the U.S., there really is no other candidate. Japan and Germany, powerful as they may be, don't want the job, and even if they did, nobody would want to follow them. So the real problem here, the reason I keep going back to a cold peace is that we have an excruciating dilemma. It would be hard enough if it was only domestic, but it's not. And I think that the rest of the 90s is going to be, will be seen in retrospect as a period of tremendous disorder as we try to work out our domestic agenda against the backdrop of an international environment which, even if we try, is likely not to be so cooperative. It's a gloomy message, but if we had to pick one thing to do, all other things equal, it would be to get our domestic house in order. Because during the next several years, there is no hope for a peaceful, cooperative world unless we are much stronger than we are. If we can do both, domestic and international, that would be terrific. But if we could do only one, the challenge is not abroad, but it is here. Thank you. So I'd be delighted to answer some of your questions. The question is, could I give another example of how the government and the private sector could cooperate, presumably in a way that they're not now? The example I gave was in training. I think another area is in the building of infrastructure in the country. I mean, I don't favor an intrusive government. But I think that one of the things that we have just totally lost sight of, to take an example, is the role that the federal budget plays. You know, we're in such debt that when we hear budget, all we think about is balancing it, or debt, or taxes, or you know, cutting entitlements, or something like that. But in fact, when the government, any other government, prepares a budget, that is a signal to the rest of the economy about what the priorities should be. And there are many ways for the government and the private sector to cooperate, whether it's in developing certain kinds of technologies, whether it's in the government providing seed money for certain kinds of infrastructure projects. It's not the government that has to do the work, but I think it's the government that has to set some framework for national priorities. One of the things that I noticed in studying Japan and Germany is that for whatever you think of those two countries, you know, there is a strategy. There is an economic strategy. We don't have that. It sounds kind of basic, but we have no economic strategy beyond the next quarter. Our strategy, if you ask the government what the strategy is, it's always in retrospect what we tried to do. And this is I can't hammer at this enough, that unless it's the government that sets some kind of framework, I'm not even going to suggest what the actual framework is. We have, with such a pluralistic society, we have no capability of focusing on a handful of really major goals. And I think we absolutely have to. The time has come for that. The question is, to meet these challenges, I can't say it as well as you did, but to meet these challenges, don't we need better public officials? And I think you're saying, is the public capable of electing them? Well, I take some heart from the massive protest vote which is going on now. I mean, you can interpret it a couple of ways, but the way I interpret it is this, that the public really is fed up. And they're fed up not only with all the political games, but they're really fed up because none of the political leaders, including the presidential candidates, is really telling us what we know. They are not describing the depth of the problems, nor the things that we have to do. And in our guts, we may not be able to articulate it, but we know that things are much worse than they're telling us, and we know that the solutions put forward are for the most part, still very conventional. I think what accounts for the Perot phenomenon is that he hasn't said anything, and so in our minds, we think he's about to. As soon as he does, he's dead. I don't know how to answer your question other than to say that if we don't have confidence in our ability to elect the right people, if we can't see beyond the shenanigans of the last several years with the things you're saying, the negative campaigning and stuff, then none of the problems I'm talking about, they all pale compared to that. Because I don't see any way that that system's not going to change. So I guess it's sort of a individual responsibility to take these issues maybe more seriously than we have before. The question is, when I compare the United States with Japan and Germany, those two countries are so much smaller and so much more homogeneous. What is the validity of the comparison? And well, from a factual standpoint, this is the way I look at it. Japan, I guess, is not much bigger than the state of California in area. But in terms of GNP now, it's about two-thirds the U.S. And there are a lot of economists who are saying that by the end of the century, the GNP will be the same as ours. So you can't say that Japan is small. And the notion sort of a physical territory is much different these days because, it used to be that physical territory related, say, to military capability, and I'm saying that's not the issue, or it related to the market to sell products. But the world is the market now. So a country can be much smaller than Japan. It has the same market, basically, that we do. Everybody has our market, in addition to us. Germany, I look at slightly differently. It's smaller GNP-wise. But the way I think about Germany now is that it is basically, it is pulling the strings of a good deal of Europe. So it's not that we're really competing only with Germany. We're competing with a German-dominated Europe, which makes Germany very, very powerful. It's not that Germany has 25 or 30% of the West European GNP. It's that there is a European market of some 400 million people, and Germany is the most influential member. So I think in terms of size, I can compare them with some conscience. The other issue that you mentioned, though, is very, very important, and that is that we are, among the three countries, we are highly pluralistic, highly individualistic, and in Japan and Germany, much more homogeneous, and certainly much more group-oriented. But that, to me, is the point. That's the reality. I'm certainly not advocating that we change our individualism, and I think that our pluralistic society is a wonderful thing, in principle, and I would never advocate changing that. But that's our starting point, and we have to That has to be the assumption we make. Given that, we're going to operate a certain way. That's why we can't take the Japanese system and transplant it here. We can take elements of it. We can look at the way that their industries plan for the future. We can't take the German system either, with its very strong social safety net. We couldn't afford that in a million years. But we can look at the way they train their workers for such high skills. So they're not three countries that are exactly the same, but we have to. I guess this is the main point. We have to compare ourselves. In fact, in my book, I'm advocating. Sounds like a gimmick, but it's part of a whole list of things that there be an annual report card that's either part of the State of the Union message or something that the National Security Council puts out, which compares us on a whole range of levels to the other major countries, because we're not living in a vacuum of the way we used to. And I'm not going back 100 years. I mean, 20 years ago, we could afford to disregard the rest of the world, or certainly regard it with a lot less intensity. But what does it mean? Our education system, we measure our education system now, is a good example, vis-a-vis what it was 10, 20 years ago. But that's only one standard. We've got to measure it against what kids in Japan and Germany are learning. Let's just take health care. We have a big debate on health care, as we should here, and we compare it to how much money we spent before, who had access before. But health care is in addition to all the other problems, it's a big competitive issue. American firms bear tremendous financial burdens because of the way our health care system is financed. An American automobile costs $700 or $800 more than the equivalent Japanese or German automobile, because the Japanese and German companies are not burdened with the same kind of health care costs. So virtually everything we do, in my opinion, has to be seen not just vis-a-vis our own experience, which is certainly very important, but vis-a-vis other standards. And unless we do that, I think we're living in a dream world. The question really is how to get government and industry to cooperate, because the history of this goes way back before you. I mean, goes back to the beginning of the country. Government and industry in our country, with just a few exceptions in history, mainly the wars, really have an antagonistic relationship. And I have no magic answer to that, other than to say that it has to start at the very top of the government. That we have had, we haven't had a president in a long time who has tried to set a tone which is less confrontational. But I don't want to blame this only on the government. I'll tell you what, I work on Wall Street, and you can't, it's very hard to point to any leaders in the private sector in this country right now, too. They're all concerned only with their own bottom line. There was a time, it seems to me, in this country where a lot of people in the private sector were public figures. Public because they did a lot beyond their immediate company. But we have, I think, gone so far in the opposite direction now. And frankly, I blame that, on the last 10 years. I think that the tone that was set by President Reagan was really one in which both government was denigrated. Of course, that was a major part of his platform. And the private sector was encouraged to be as selfish as it possibly could, and that was seen as good. I mean, I don't think there's no magic answer here, but I would hope that the nature of the problems that I described, which I see obviously is so deep, will be enough to jolt the next couple of administrations into realizing that the way we have operated in the past was a luxury because we were so powerful, and that it can't work. That system can't work for us in the future, for a lot of reasons, including the fact that we are competing with countries that are under no such illusions that you can entrust the national interest is just the sum of the private interest, because it's simply not. The question was, how do you break the how do you break the prevailing spirit in this society, which means that people don't want to give up anything? What was the second?
The second part was, do you feel that if you could answer that you could get
Oh, yes. So,
problems resolved by
right.
the Congress and the President?
Should the Congress and the President be the same party? Well, let me start with the second. I think that divided government is not going to serve us well, you know, while we deal with the kind of problems I'm talking about. So for the next decade, I think it would be a great advantage to us to have a much more unified government, which I think has to be. I can't imagine that scenario under a divided government. I suppose it's possible, but it's very unlikely. But even that certainly is not going to be enough. I guess what I would do, if I think that the next president, I think you put your finger on a very, very important problem. And incidentally, I have, in conjunction with the book, I have been on a lot of radio talk shows. And, you know, they're from all over the states. And I would say the question you asked me is a question everybody from every walk of life, from every economic strata asks, and that is, they just come at it slightly differently, and they say, what makes you think we're going to give up anything? And that's a very depressing question. And I think that the only thing I can say is that the next president, if he believes that the problems are more or less as I stated them, if he's committed to do something about it, he has to acknowledge the problem that you're citing, and he has to spend an enormous amount of his time as sort of the national cheerleader. Not as what President Carter did, as sort of the engineer, and not as Mr. Perot is talking about, which is being the mechanic under the hood. But he really has to go to every corner of this country and use the power of his office and persuasion to make us realize that there has to be very dramatic change. I don't think as a country we realize that at all. I mean, I'm just one of hundreds of people who are talking about, thousands of people talking about these same problems, but I don't think most people really believe it. The surveys show that even something like the educational system, which, I mean, I don't know how much more evidence you need, most people think that they say it's bad, but where my kids go to school, it's fine. Or they say, the political system is rotten, but my representative's okay. The next president is not going to be elected on this. I think he's going to be elected on something probably totally, character or whatever. But that's his first job is not necessarily to start proposing a lot of detailed policies, I think, but make us feel, make us understand the situation that we're in as a country, and get some momentum of spirit behind. That's the only way that there can be a revolution, not a revolution in the streets, but a revolution of thinking. Question is really one of sort of comparative government. Let me broaden it a little bit, is how do the institutions of the economic institutions of Japan and Germany compare to ours? And, they're all really quite different. I would say that Japan, by far, has the most integrated approach to trade and investment because they put everything in one super agency. Germany doesn't even have a Ministry of Trade. It has a Ministry of Economics. But they look at trade as not as some extraneous commercial issue. I mean, trade is sort of woven into virtually everything. Germany was a major exporter in the late 1800s because that's the way it could industrialize. I think that the real, and I make this recommendation in my book, the real change that we have to make is to make what is now the National Security Council focus on domestic, economic, and social issues as well as the military ones. That we have to start there, because unless we have that kind of priority, and unless we invest these issues with that sort of prestigious group, we're just arranging the chairs on the deck, and we're not changing the mindset. Question is, that my answer to the question about how do you get people to give up something sounds like Jerry Brown, and he's been labeled an eccentric. Well, I don't mind being called an eccentric.
He's been discounted, which is
Right.
harsher than being labeled.
Well, he's been discounted, but I think he's been discounted for a lot of reasons other than that. That particular message, I saw him talk in New York, and that particular message about the need to change the system seems to me to have resonated very strongly.
With the Clinton campaign?
Well, not with the Clinton people, but I think in the country. That is the one message that Jerry Brown got out to a lot of people, and I never heard anyone deride him for that. And the question is, aren't we ahead of Japan and Germany in dealing with a pluralistic society, and don't they face great disadvantages, I guess presumably because those pressures are coming on them? Well, I think that as a real society, our pluralism is a wonderful thing, and that we are all enriched. I doubt anyone, probably everybody in this audience came from somewhere else in the last generation or two. So we don't have to belabor that. But I think that if you're really hard-nosed about it, dealing with our pluralism it's necessary, but it's a real problem now. That there was a time when we could assimilate people much better than we do today. And I can't tell you exactly why, but there was a time when our schools would take in immigrants who would graduate, who would be literate, who would have tremendous desire to get ahead. And I don't think that the nature of immigration has changed so much. I think it's that American institutions have not retained the kind of vibrancy that they once had. And so we've really got to work at this. I mentioned the example from the workforce of 60% of the new entrants coming from minorities, most of which are or half of which are going to be, immigrants. This is a big problem. It's a real burden. One we have to shoulder. I don't think Japan and Germany are going to reach this stage for a long time. I'm only talking about the next 10 years. But in Japan, the level of, there may be some pressure, but they're handling it a different way. They would rather move their industries offshore than bring people onshore to operate those industries. And although I'm sure there's going to be some openings in Japan, it's minuscule by our standards. And in Germany, yes, there have been a lot of refugees, but there is no immigration policy in Germany right now, and all the pressures are to narrow the possibilities of bringing in new people. Now they're going to have to take a lot more than they want, but relative to us, we have 20 million people in this country living here now who were born somewhere else. And the 1980s was in the 1980s we had more immigrants as a percent of the population than any other decade in history, and this shows no sign of let-up. I've seen statistics which says we now take close to 50% of all people crossing borders. So this country, in terms of the degree of pluralism, no one is going to face this kind of polyglot society, none of the three countries that I talk about, in a long, long time. So yes, we're ahead, in the sense of having the experience, but if you really want to be tough about it, it's going to take a lot of our energies to keep up with this. The question was, could I comment on Alliance Airport as an example of government-industry cooperation? I'm sorry, I don't know the project.